honored today to host an event that really looks forward at the future of air superiority mission. People look at this concept and they think about air battles from the past, whether it be P-51s over Europe or F-86s over Korea. And that really looks at a fighter versus fighter concept, and yet what we're focusing in the future is a very, very different concept. So the more we can discuss this and explore it in a world in which other assets like information play in this construct, it's going to be critical how we plan for the future. With us today is Major General Jeff Newell and also Alexander Andy Massey, who are here to explore this further. So without further ado.
All right, thanks, Doug, for the introduction. Thanks to the Mitchell Institute for hosting this event, gathering friends of the Air Force and air power together periodically to discuss important issues. And for those of you that work here on the Hill that are watching us across the river and making sure that we get it right for the nation and for the American taxpayers, these are important events, and we appreciate you hosting us here today. Today we're going to offer some observations about the future of warfare in air, space, and cyber, how we're thinking about the future of warfare, and how we position the Air Force to continue to be the dominant air power in the world. This is absolutely the right time to have these discussions, and as Wing Commander Andy Massey will discuss, we're at an inflection point in the evolution of air and space warfare. For the last 25 years, really since the wall came down, and certainly in the last 15 since 9/11, we focused our efforts on the Middle East, primarily against non-state insurgent networks, and have in many ways transformed how we exploit air and space power to support land forces. And as Andy will explain, this is what you do when you have a monopoly on the control of air and space. However, this monopoly has been a historical anomaly, and it will soon come to an end. Today's Air Force is extremely proficient in supporting land forces in a low-end conflict, but is increasingly being challenged in air and space domains, the core mission for which it exists. This is due to a series of investment choices we've made to defer modernization on air-to-air and other domain control platforms for the purpose of ensuring we can win today's fight. But as Secretary Carter recently said in SAS testimony in March, quote, "Today's security environment is dramatically different from the last 25 years, requiring new ways of investing and operating. 5 evolving strategic challenges, namely Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism, are now driving DoD's planning and budgeting, and they're reflected in our current budget." Deputy Secretary Work recently remarked in Colorado Springs just a couple weeks ago, he talked about the reemergence of great power competition, and it will, quote, "require that we exercise strategic muscles we've allowed to atrophy since the end of the Cold War." Those in this room don't need to be reminded of that. And this is the driving force behind his push for a third offset strategy, the search for technology-enabled concepts to strengthen conventional deterrence against major powers. And in some ways, the third offset is how we conduct warfare and are looking for ways to counter our power projection strategy. And as Andy will argue, concepts such as anti-access, area denial, are simply the strategy-counter-strategy dynamic at work, as no military advantage is lasting against a thinking adversary. They are evolving, and we must evolve too. This brings me to discussing some of the work that we do in the Directorate of Strategy, Concepts, and Assessments at the headquarters. We're charged by the Secretary and Chief of Staff to help them develop the vision and strategy for tomorrow's Air Force, one that continues to outpace adversaries in a competitive environment. We help them articulate the capabilities we need, how we transform the current Air Force into the one that we want to be. We've done great work with this under the leadership of Colonel Mike Trumpfeller, who's here in the room, our strategy division chief, who published a series of documents, including not only an overarching strategy, but a strategic master plan that we've never had before to actually implement the strategy, down to unit-level taskings to make sure we actually sort of walk the talk in implementing our strategy. We've always had some vision about where we want to go, but this is one that actually has teeth. We also have a future operating concept that really outlines and defines where we want to be, and we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. This is new, and this is new and important work that the Air Staff hasn't done in the future. We're proud of the work that our strategy team has done, and now we're on the road to implementation. And our current Vice Chief, General Goldfein, has really taken this as a personal initiative to ensure that the staff is actually making progress with milestones, not 5 years from now, but this year. And we're very excited about his leadership and the work we're doing in this regard. So when you're doing strategy, if you do this right, in my view, you start at the beginning with fundamental questions like, why do we exist? What's our fundamental role in implementing national policy? What should the United States Air Force make its #1 priority? And we're not alone in asking these questions, and we're not the first to do it. In the decade after World War II, the Navy asked itself these very questions. It had built the greatest Navy the world had ever known, with over 6,000 ships and 28 aircraft carriers. But it had based its existence on the premise of controlling the seas, and after World War II, it had no challenger. So it was now faced with explaining to Congress and the American public, why then did the Navy exist, and why should American taxpayers continue to maintain its existence? In 1954, Samuel Huntington helped the Navy answer that question. Huntington explained that sea and air forces had a unique role, different from land forces but critical to their success. And this article was the starting point that the work that Andy Massey has done and the basis of his talk today. The idea of domain control, the first priority of the Air Force and Navy, is a fundamental concept that underlies all the debates about where the Air Force should prioritize investment. You can link any issue of the day about what the Air Force is trying to spend money on this issue of tension between domain control and supporting land forces. And we'll talk more about this today. It's about how we prioritize our investments. And with this concept understood, you'll see the Air Force is indeed at a critical point in its evolution, and we have important choices to make about its future. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Andy, and time permitting, I'll come back after he's finished and add some thoughts on what I believe to be our critical challenges in regard to the third offset, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Before I do, let me briefly introduce Andy. Wing Commander Andy Massey is a native of Aberdeen, Scotland. He graduated from RAF College Cranwell in 1997, and following pilot training spent 8 years in the Tornado Force as a ground attack and reconnaissance roles, including multiple deployments in support of Operation Southern Watch and Iraqi Freedom. Following staff assignments in the UK 16 Air Assault Brigade, including a deployment to Afghanistan and RAF Air Command, our headquarters equivalent, he completed a 2-year tour at the RAF's MQ-9 Reaper Squadron at Creech Air Force Base, Nevada. Following 2 years in Alabama at our Air Command and Staff College and our Advanced Strategy School, SAS, Andy joined our staff, working for Mike Trumpfeller in our Strategy Division last June. He'll leave the Pentagon next month to go back to the MQ-9 at Creech, this time commanding the 39 Squadron at Creech. So he's continuing to move on at the RAF, and his talents are being well recognized. I was just asking him, he of course has his family here, and he will have been here continuously in the U.S. for 7 years by the time he goes back. And so I asked if his kids are adopting a U.S. accent, and indeed, I'm afraid they are. So he'll have to work on that when he finally goes home. But during his time on our staff, he's tackled head-on some of the foremost challenges facing the United States Air Force. He's working on a U.S. Air Force issue, and you'll see that that's the genesis of his talk today. And I think he will prove to be one of the most consequential thinkers of his generation on air power theory, and I mean that quite sincerely. So with that introduction, let me turn the floor over to Andy, who has a slide presentation for you, and then I'll come back and offer some thoughts at the end. So Andy, over to you.
So thank you very much for your kind words. The presentation I'm going to give you today is going to be titled Defining the Central Purpose of the United States Air Force. But the first thing I would like to do before I canter through this subject is to say thank you to both yourself and Colonel Mike Trumpfeller for your leadership, because the opportunity to explore different ideas in the Pentagon is not something I was pre-briefed I would have the chance to do. And I would like to say that the work I'm about to present to you is not my work alone. I work in a team of about 10 or 12 people who are all extremely talented and very open to sharing ideas. So I get the opportunity and privilege to brief this subject, and the paper that's been presented later today, the truth is that's a mix of ideas from all of the people who I work with, who are undoubtedly much smarter than I am. It would be completely inappropriate, I think, for a British officer to give a presentation on strategy without putting a picture of Winston Churchill on the slide. But I think this is really important. It captures two important themes I think I want to draw today. One is, as General Neal said, when you look around the room, you can probably find the air crew in the audience. Air power tends to be practiced by very pragmatic people, not philosophers. And you can probably tell that by the hair on the back of their hands. The challenge with that is it means that because we're very pragmatic people, we do a lot of doing, not a lot of thinking. It therefore means that sometimes in our business, we don't take the time to stop and think about what it is that we're actually delivering. And that's what I want to try and address today. And the genesis of this presentation really was a conversation that we had in our office. We were drawing together a brief on air superiority. And the three pictures you can see on the top of the slide there were those that were being used. And it seemed to me that when I was looking at those pictures and listening to the conversation, that was completely dichotomous with my experience in operations in the previous 15 years. And I was thinking of hard decks that had been applied to my platform when I was operating Iraq, trying to do ISR on convoys in 2004 and 2005. And that the air that was underneath me I couldn't penetrate to exploit. I thought about journeys in and out of forward operating bases in Afghanistan in the back of a helicopter, where 3 or 4 setbacks was the routine and not one. And I thought of spiraling descent approaches into main operating bases at night in different places in the world. And it really made me question the assumptions that people in the room were stating, which is that we've had air superiority in those theatres for the last 15 years and been able to exploit air power freely. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that's quite the case. And that led to the idea that air superiority isn't something that's practiced in one domain. Air superiority is something that is practiced across domains. And you leverage those domains into the air to deliver air superiority. And that seemed to be something I felt was sort of missing from the confrontation we had. And I also felt that the conversation in the top 3 slides takes you to some major great power conflicts. But it meant that we were maybe missing lessons from some of the conflicts that we're fighting today and we weren't applying them. So any theory or any conversation about air superiority, we needed to leverage that experience that we could gain through extremely hard and costly conflicts. And most importantly, we're in a strategy cell. So we're in the business of practicing strategic thinking, which undoubtedly is based upon some form of problem. And the problem is undoubtedly some sort of complex social phenomenon that can't be solved with a simple solution. Otherwise, we just practice tactics. But we're trying to solve something which is complex and very hard to get your hands around. And in any kind of endeavor like that, then clarity and focus is really, really important. And it's apparent the United States and all Western nations really face an extremely cluttered, complex environment. And we need to therefore really be very precise with our language and focus on those threats that we feel are actually a major challenge to allow us to adequately sort of focus our resource against them. I think things like the proliferation of internet technology or information technologies, the rise of great power threats, the use of other instruments of power by states to achieve their ends aggressively, the rise of non-state actors, the democratization of violence through the proliferation of that information technology. All those things make for a very, very complex strategic environment, I feel, and therefore the Air Force needs to make sure that in the strategic document set is crystal clear about what its priorities are, its challenges are. So when I turned to that document set, I just felt I was left a little bit wanting. And because we're the division that is meant to be providing that, that is where I really wanted to try and put in some spade work. And the reason I say that is when I was reading through the document set, it was really apparent to me that we knew what the challenges were and we knew what it was that Air Force does. So the sort of what and the business end, the pragmatic side of air power was really clearly delivered. And it was a really clear and persuasive message. But it didn't say to me why the Air Force or why air power. And I think in a very complex environment where there are multiple actors, then the Air Force needs to be really clear about what it is that it does and why it should be the Air Force the nation turns to. And really that's where we come to the quote at the bottom, which is lifted from a paper that Samuel Huntington wrote in 1954. And in looking at the role of the Navy in providing for the nation, he was crystal clear. And the question the Navy had to answer was, what function do you perform that obligates society to assume responsibility for your maintenance? We don't just exist as artifacts on a shelf. So each of the services needs to prove its value and worth in the nation, especially, I think, in a time of strategic confusion. So I therefore elected to turn to model, which is not an attempt to mirror the real world, but it's an attempt to use a metaphor with a very simple graphic that might be able to draw something of value from which we can learn. So in the face of complexity, to demonstrate simply, potentially how the services function. I chose this Venn diagram, which is effectively the cumulative capability of the military entity of any nation. And that's divided into 3 physical domains in which units operate, which are the air, the land, and the sea, or the maritime. All of that military activity has one end, and that is for those military services to bring violence to bear against an adversary to achieve the political ends. And at the end of the day, the confluence of all that activity is going to have to be a change in politics. And that's going to take place in the land component. That does not give primacy to an army or an air force or navy. It's just a recognition that we live on the land, and that's where the majority of our populations live. But the air and maritime domains can have significant effects if they're leveraged into the air and land domains. So what the graphic shows you there is three separate circles. And our general thinking would be to see them as being independent, with some independencies between them. So there is a bit of an overlap there. In each of the domains, therefore, we've constructed services that function within that domain, that physical domain specifically. So an example might be up here at the top of the blue circle, you might see an F-22 meeting an adversary aircraft in open airspace and conducting an air-to-air combat. And that would be the air domain being contested by air assets to achieve some advantage in the air domain. Similarly, the clash at sea would sit here in the maritime domain, or the contest that we see taking place between US and British Special Forces on the ground with ISIL would be a contest in here. So it's a direct contest within one domain, between components of that domain. So that's what the big circles show, military activity from that domain into that domain. So when you show the circles like this, you can also see that there's an overlap. So there's an overlap here between air and land. And that overlap would be demonstrative of the desire to take the advantages of the air domain and project it onto the land. Or alternatively, to use the advantage you hold on the land and project it into the air. So the domains don't exist on their own, they overlap. So an example in the United States Air Force might be a platform like the A-10, where the Air Force holds a capability that it projects into the land battle. That is the nature and the desired effect you want to achieve from that platform. Similarly, in the United States, you hold capabilities like Patriot in the Army. So Patriot would be an example in this overlap here of where the land domain is being projected into the air domain to contest the domain. So the domains do overlap with one another, and the contest of that domain happens both within the domain and across domains. But I think what's really important here is that you have to recognise that where the contest takes place between domains, we're not substituting activity. So when we're using CAS, or we're using the A-10 to ground battle, then we'd say that sort of 3 or 4 airmen or 3 or 4 airplanes is not a value to equivalent unit in an army component. We're saying that the advantages of exploiting the height, speed and reach of air power is of significant benefit into the land battle and amplifies the capability of my land forces. So close air support isn't a substitute for land forces, it amplifies or augments the capability of the land component. So we're not substituting one for the other here, we're leveraging our advantage into another domain to its benefit. And similarly, you can make an argument that something like Patriot is extremely mobile in a cluttered land environment. So using ground-based air defences can be a significant benefit, because it is very challenging for an adversary to find it. So there are benefits in each domain that can be leveraged against another if you wanted the strengths of the land or the air or the maritime component. So that's what the overlap show. And I would also therefore say to you that if you were in one of those bubbles and you were the 4-star general who commanded that service, you would want to hold the capabilities to both push off other nations' maritime air components, and you'd also want the ability to leverage that advantage. So for example, if I was in charge of land, I would want to pull some of that air stuff that's a benefit to me. So for example, I would want to have air cavalry. Because air cavalry is a great opportunity for me to leverage the air domain into the land battle. So I'm still the land component commander, and they're still land component entities, but I want them organically. Because I don't want to rely on the Air Force to determine the priority of that asset. I want to leverage the air domain into the land domain. So organic capabilities of that are really, I think, quite easy to explain with a simple model like this. And similarly, if you're the maritime component commander, if someone has radars on the coast that can threaten you, I want the ability here to have aircraft I can move ashore and deny that capability to an adversary. So I want the ability to reach from the air, in this example here, using the maritime environment into the land environment. So the services are organised around the physical domains, but the services leverage the advantages of all of those domains where they're needed organically. Now, when you put all of that together, what that also says to you, I think, is that activity within a domain allows you to exploit it. So if I live in the air domain, then I have the opportunity to exploit the air domain. But maritime and land component can affect me. So the land and maritime component have the ability to deny air superiority in certain areas. But they can't exploit the air domain. All the land and maritime component can do here is affect a portion of the air domain. But it still leaves a large portion of the air domain free for me to exploit. So cross-domain activity can deny advantage in a domain, but it doesn't allow you to control it. To control and exploit the advantage of being in a domain, you need to be in it. So that's what a diagram like that will tell you, I think, if you looked at a Venn diagram of the three services, and therefore built a picture of what those forces are. And what I would say to you is that the Air Force is the service primarily charged to contest the air domain. That diagram would tell you that that's what an Air Force does. One last thing. And that diagram would also explain to you why the United States has multiple air forces. Because the land component wants to leverage air into the land environment. So it has land, in the land component you have air forces. And in the Navy you have air forces in the Marine Corps of the US Navy. So that would explain to you why in your nation you have multiple air forces in the nation. But the Air Force itself is the service that's designed to contest solely the air environment. Now, where Huntington's article is a real benefit here, I think, is what Samuel Huntington explored is how a change in the military environment, and this Venn diagram covers the whole environment, can force a change in the focus of the service. And what Huntington looked at in 1954 is how the US Navy was changing its focus. And what he recognized is that in the early years of the Cold War, that the United States Navy didn't really face a peer competitor. Its adversary was not able to overmatch it or compete in certain environments. So the Navy was able to shift its focus and its emphasis into the land and the air components. So because the Navy did not have to expend too much effort, and this outer part of the circle here, the bit that would be traditional Navy business, because that was not being contested, it was able to project its influence into the land and the air domains. And that means that the Navy was able to therefore deny capability to the USSR in the land and the air component, because the Navy could project its power ashore. So the experience in a monopoly versus a competition is the second takeaway, which is very important for service, I think. And when I read the article, it led me to consider the predicament that the United States Air Force was facing today. So you take those two takeaways and apply the deductions together and say that in a monopoly, the service has the opportunity to leverage its advantage into the air or the maritime or the other two domains. And if you take that each individual service is charged to contest its own domain, when you put those two together, that allows you to frame a sentence like the one I have below, which you can address in two chunks. So let's just say that the purpose of an Air Force is to gain, i.e. to challenge this part of the Venn diagram, and then to exploit that advantage into the land and maritime domains. In that order. That is the purpose of any of the services, but in the air domain, the purpose of the Air Force, therefore, is to gain, then exploit advantage in the air domain. Now that construct, I think, could then be applied when you look to the challenge the United States has faced since 1991. So with the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States was left with extremely potent military capability, absent the adversary that that force had been built against. And that force is now being referred to as the second offset force. The force was built as a design-to-use maneuver against mass. And in many ways, you could say the second offset force, I think, was built around the Air Force, because it leveraged the advantages of air and space into the land environment. So what the second offset force was built to do, and it was demonstrated in Desert Storm in 1991, is it was designed to take this recognition that air presented an asymmetric advantage, and say that when I have contested and achieved victory in the air domain, the first stage in any major campaign, I can then take that capability and project it into the land and maritime domains, and then exploit the advantages that air power gives me into the land environment. So that's effectively what the Desert Storm or second offset force is. It allows you to exploit maneuver over mass. The Air Force built a reconnaissance strike complex, and it had the ability to operate 24 hours a day. So they developed some capabilities that could operate through the night, let the Air Force become a 24-hour organization, which prevented adversaries from doing the standard night routine of cleaning and washing the bottles and then moving the military capability somewhere else. The night was no longer a shroud for an adversary. Importantly, adversaries would have protected that space with radar, but the development of low observable capabilities by the United States unveiled in Desert Storm meant that the night was no longer a shroud for an adversary. So you could have 24-hour tempo, and you could achieve decisive effects regardless of the time of day or night. So it allowed the air component to be leveraged into the land domain. But the global war on terror and the attacks of 9/11 also forced, I would say, an acceleration in the change in that emphasis. So post-Desert Storm, absent peer competitor, the Air Force rightly shifted its focus into land campaign because that was the need of the nation. And actually it recognized the strategic environment, which is that the Air Force did not face a significant competition in the air domain. So the Air Force could shift resource to allow it to leverage that capability into the land and maritime environments. Examples of that, I think, would be anything you see in the open source press over the last 2 or 3 years about the depletion of the F-22 program, about changes in emphasis in the nuclear enterprise, and modernization. So those sort of capabilities were sacrificed to deliver capability in the land campaign. Really importantly, I am not criticising any decisions that people made at that time under duress, and I'm not trying to be a smarty pants by waving that away. I'm trying to say that a model like this would demonstrate to you why that would happen, because it was exactly the right thing to do in the strategic environment that the United States faced. But it would also cause you to recognise that in any strategic competition, your adversaries are observing your behaviour. And adversaries will seek to find a chink in your armour that they can exploit. So that change in the United States emphasis would not be lost on its adversary. It's also, I think, really critically, a recognition of the trade-offs and the opportunity costs that has to be made in any strategic endeavour. So there is no right answer, there are just better wrong answers. But it behoves us all to therefore try and recognise the second-order effects of the decisions we're making today. Now, I know there are some F4 pilots in the audience, so there's a joke for them coming up. But I think one of the neat things about something which is designed extremely cleverly is that it can be transparent to you. An example I would like to use is the example of the cell phone on the left-hand side. So something which is extremely well constructed and designed, its true nature can be hidden to the user. And when we look at that graph there of the change in the cellular phone, you'll see the phones get smaller and smarter and cheaper as time goes on. Whereas the aircraft on the right-hand side kind of do the opposite. But what that doesn't tell you is the true nature of the device you're using. And if you were to carry any one of those telephones and lose the cell network, what you'd find is even with the very smartest phone on the right-hand side, all you have is the capability to do advanced calculations on your phone or read the book that you downloaded yesterday. You're stuck with whatever was on the phone before the network was shut down. I would advocate the same thing as applied to the aircraft on the right-hand side. So as we have advanced capabilities and we look at these really advanced artifacts, what we lose is the architecture that sits behind those smart devices. I was going to make a joke here about the F-14 being more advanced than the F-16, but the point would be as you go down the ladder of aircraft, they do become more exquisite, but they also become much more intelligent. But their intelligence is delivered to them by the software that they carry and the system that they sit upon. So intelligent design masks the nature of the product. And I think when we talk, therefore, about Desert Storm as I just have, or the force that built the second offset, what we tend to do is focus on the exquisite platforms and the capabilities that we deliver. But what we don't do is buy into the value of the information that was in that network that allowed that capability to be delivered. And I think that's fundamental to the advantage the Air Force leverages today. Because I think we'd have to recognise that we've returned to a competition and that the picture on the left-hand side as a Venn diagram is probably more realistic. We have the three physical domains I described earlier, And whereas I was talking about air as though it was air and space, the truth is we now have space power, and we have cyber, or the exploitation of the EMS separately. And I think when I look at that diagram, I would say that I can see there are 4 physical domains that are natural, and there's one domain, which I'm calling cyber EMS, which is really the architecture of the glue that allows us to operate between those 4 things and delivers us technology. So the yellow bubble up there is the thing that we have made to allow us to exploit those other 4 things. So it sits separately because it's man-made, but it exists within each of those other domains. So what you'd say then is what the West really did in the Cold War is it learned to leverage the advantages from one domain into another. And most importantly, it recognized that information technologies could amplify the capabilities that already existed in the physical domains. I think what's really important is that whilst I show that Venn diagram, it's crystal clear that it's separate to the way that we currently think about the services as husbanding individual physical domains. But I don't think that that diagram has been lost to our adversaries. So our strategic approach has been understood, and our adversaries have recognized that you can leverage advantage from one domain into another. And most critically, when you do that, you can't control that domain. But what you can do is you can deny it. So if you're exploiting cyber attacks into the air domain, you can have a significant impact on air superiority from the cyber domain. So we're taking that lesson from the 3 physical domains and applying it using cyber or EMS or similar to space. So what that means is the very place where the United States military want to operate is in the confluence of the domains. Because in that confluence of points, you can put the adversary on horns of a dilemma and exploit your advantage from the air, from the sea, from space, or from the land. And that very point is therefore where you're able to use one domain to amplify the capability of another. And you can therefore pare down your force and have it at lower readiness states to hold in peacetime, but be prepared to use in wartime. But the recognition that there's an overlay between that Venn diagram and the cyber and the AMS and space is so valuable actually allows our adversaries to put a huge hole in the middle of the Venn diagram and our chosen area of operations. And I think to show that that's not just a model or a simple pictorial description of something, on the right-hand side, I've put up an image of the battle space. You can see quite clearly the network that's operating in that battle space between maritime assets, airborne assets, the land component, and space. And you can see the connective tissue is the architecture, which is somewhere between information technology and the electromagnetic spectrum. And if you're able to deny a chunk of space, or you're able to physically target a network on the ground through denial of service, let's say into an air operations center, that would manifest itself in the loss of a block of airspace to you within your cross boundaries. So it isn't a simple Venn diagram, I think, that demonstrates a picture. I think you can actually demonstrate that in a real-world graphic and show that that has an effect on the ground and the air on which we can operate and contest. So I think the challenge we face is that our strategic approach has been unpicked in a depiction of the 4 physical domains and cyber EMS as a Venn diagram, and been demonstrated in our physical fighting environment. And that's something that we need to come to terms with. Now, it's not my nature to be pessimistic. So I wanted to use this document as a demonstration of what I'm saying to you is not lost on the United States Air Force. I wanted to use the Venn diagrams as a way of capturing, I think, our challenge. The document that the team I have the pleasure to work with wrote last summer is called the Air Force Operating Concept, Future Operating Concept. And I think it recognizes the Venn diagram that I've shown you and projects forward a way for the Air Force to survive and to win in a competitive environment. So for those who work in a cell like mine, that document is effectively our North Star. The central idea in that document is operational agility. And it recognizes that the 5 core functions of the Air Force will have to evolve over time. But most importantly, it recognizes that air superiority will no longer be won in the air domain alone. And that any approach to future air superiority has to be a multi-domain approach, as the Venn diagram demonstrated. Effects in space and cyber, or for that end land and the maritime component, can be projected into the air domain to deny access. So for any future Air Force to describe air superiority, it can't afford to talk about air superiority being achieved within the air domain alone. But the primary purpose of the Air Force is to first gain, then exploit advantage of the air domain. So any future Air Force strategic document or strategic armament has to revolve around a multi-domain approach, which allows the Air Force to leverage the advantage of the air domain, having gained advantage in space or cyber. So I'd like to hand to you.
Let me just elaborate on these comments, a couple, and then we'll bring Andy back up and we can talk about some questions. Okay, first of all, when you hear the word MDOC, Multi-Domain Operations Center, this is essentially the underlying concept behind it. That we believe that the Air Force is really well positioned to understand and exploit multi-domain operations. The Vice Chief calls it domain on demand. So this idea of using and exploiting other domains for the purpose of achieving military objectives is going to be increasingly part of what we do. So we like to we think that the current Air Operations Center is basically produces an ATO and overlays sort of space and cyber on top. We've got to transition our way of thinking, so we're truly looking at multi-domain approaches to how we operate and fight. Let's go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm flicking. Sorry, sorry, I got it. Okay, quickly here, I use this slide for a whole bunch of purposes, but I want to go back to this idea of our monopoly ending. Sort of the yellow sort of portrays on the left that for most of our history we've lived in a contested domain. We have uniquely been part of a generation that has not known a contested domain, but a monopoly. And the blue up there represents my own career, where my first operational assignment was after the wall came down. It was a fake, and then went on to fly MC-130s. So even in my career, didn't know a contested environment, only knew a monopoly. This is interesting, and implicit in this is a bunch of assumptions about how we fight. Back to this the multi-domain for just a minute. If you look at where the overlaps in the Venn diagram are, we're going to have to produce airmen that are proficient in each of the different shades of the color. So you can't just produce air warriors and you can't just produce cyber warriors, but you've got to produce an airman that's proficient and understands both. We have not done our best work in this area, and we have a lot of work to do, especially in the area of cyber, just because it's so nascent. But you'll see us talking in a lot more ways about multi-domain, airmen that are proficient across domains. Okay, back to this idea of a monopoly ending. In my view, these are just my thoughts, these are some assumptions that we've raised a generation of airmen to think about. Implicit assumptions about how we fight. And the American way of war, as I described, is to project power forward, generate combat power from secure bases close to an adversary's territory, and then fight over his territory. So you can see this era of assumptions are coming to an end. Unchallenged power projection. The forward bases as sanctuaries. To lower no combat attrition. Around the circle, enduring technological advantage. We've seen that results in cost, and that results in fewer numbers at the end of the day. Assured resilience C3, and then space superiority. All of those are going to be challenged, and we'll have to think differently about them. Okay, before I go to that slide, let me talk a little bit about what I believe to be some enduring challenges. We have, as we approach the third offset strategy and define what it means for the Air Force, there's a lot of discussions about geopolitics and acquisition reform and can you force an offset and sort of a whole bunch of things that are sort of about the third offset that are central to what it means to the Air Force. And as we've gone around town, talked to think tanks and smart people about third offset, they challenged us to say, okay, you've got to define this in operational terms, what this means to the United States Air Force. So I'm going to share with you what is a work in progress with our team. And I'm coalescing around 3 big operational challenges for the Air Force. And so I'll just show those to you, and we would certainly appreciate your thoughts. And they are the following. The first is gaining and maintaining and exploiting a battle network advantage. For many years, this idea of battle networks, network-centric warfare, and the like fell flat with me, frankly. It seemed enough to want your network, your platforms to be networked, and you wanted yours to be better than the adversary. But it's been really recently that I've gained a true appreciation for the value of networks, and Andy started this discussion. So what am I talking about? In my view, a network is a community with sensor communication technology distributed across the battlespace, and they use that technology to collect, aggregate, display, and disseminate information in usable forms for rapid decision-making and coordinated action. And for me, my aha moment came when, really through Andy's discussion and talking about cell phones. Your first cell phone, my first cell phone was my Motorola flip phone. It was just a phone, like an airplane with a radio. It was not a network. It was part of the cell network, but for my purposes, it wasn't a network. The great improvement was the first smartphones that now brought the internet to my phone. But I essentially had a phone and an encyclopedia. In my view, it still wasn't a network. It wasn't until the latest generation of cell phones and apps came around that they collected real-time information from my phone. They used my phone as a sensor. They aggregated it, and they re-displayed it in a way that I could use it for decision-making. The first such app to me was the Apple Maps, or Google Maps, right? It knew how fast I was going down the highway, and it took that information and showed me where traffic jams were. It's a really simple version of using everybody's cell phone on the network to collect sensor data, aggregate it, display it in a form that I could use to make decisions. The next generation of apps to come along were Waze, the app. Now I have a whole bunch more sensor information, where road hazards are, where speed traps are. That's sensory information going in and then sent back out to the entire network, the community of users. Uber is another example of an app. It shows me where I am, shows me where drivers are. I can summon a driver, make a decision about whether there's a driver close enough to pick me up. This is a revolutionary change in how we use the network. And once again, if I take 20% of the cell phones off the network, it doesn't affect the network at all. If the network drops, what is my phone? It's an e-reader, as Andy mentioned. So the network becomes increasingly critical to how we operate. It's a force multiplier. You can apply this example on and on. So I'm a believer in networks. On to the second challenge. That's basing and operating our forces in a contested environment, basing forward. So the challenge is, how do we operate forces forward in the presence of attacks by accurate long-range strike weapons? And by forward, I don't mean necessarily our really forward bases, but it's got to be closer than the CONUS. So where is that sweet spot between contested space and basing? We've got to relook at this. And we have to recognize that most of our forces are relatively short range, and if we're going to generate offensive capability, we have to get closer to the fight. And then finally, I think we need to rethink how we generate offensive capability in the absence of air dominance as we've come to know it. We've come accustomed to operating in relatively permissive environments like Iraq and Syria, where the primary challenge is finding and fixing targets. It's about discriminating targets from civilian populations. But in the future, we have to be prepared to have every step of the kill chain challenge. How do we accomplish our precision strike missions, detect, locate, identify, track, engage, and assess against key targets in the absence of maritime and space superiority? As I've said before, technology has enabled our adversaries to challenge our power projection model of warfare. They've expanded the point of contest from their own territory into all domains around the globe. As a final analogy, I liken the evolution of the conflict to a hockey game. We have lived in a generation where we have been in an extended power play. And when you're in a power play, your adversary is shorthanded. What does he do? He collapses around his own net to defend the goal. And so you have largely sanctuary in half the rink, and air superiority or air dominance or puck dominance is largely unchallenged. You have areas of sanctuary where you actually operate for extended periods of time unimpeded. Well, the power play is about to come to an end, and we're about to be evenly matched. And just as in a hockey game, what happens when you have even sides? That means the whole ISIS challenge. And if control of the puck is likened to air superiority, that is temporal, it's challenged, it's dynamic, and you're not going to have it for extended periods of time where you simply have control of 2/3 of the ice. So that, for me, is a useful metaphor, and I hope it works for you. So in my opinion, and I don't think we have this right yet, we're continuing to tinker with this, overcoming these three challenges are the basis of the work ahead. So with that said, that's really our presentation. We have a few minutes left over for questions, and I'd like to bring Andy back up and We'll take a few questions from the floor, and just as some ground rules for us, we're going to largely stay on topic. So if we get into sort of the issues of the day, I don't track, what's happened today or yesterday here on the Hill, or what maybe the Secretary of Chief said even, in the last week or so. So I'd like to try to stay on topic as much as possible. I understand we may stray over. So Andy, why don't you come back up and let's take a few questions. Sir.
What are the problems that you have here?
One of the problems we have here in Congress right now, when we look at the issues of dominance and superiority across the spectrum and so on, are the changes that are going on when you're talking about dealing one-on-one and then team on team. And so one of the things that will certainly help us is for all those folks in the Air Force, Army, and Navy, and Marine Corps who are getting PhDs in international relations and things like that, is occasionally to break this down into how we are going to be influenced by the kind of teams we can form. Because the whole geopolitical situation, when we pivot to this hemisphere or pivot to that hemisphere and so on and so forth, it's all about team building. And as you were doing this, how long did you think about, well, this is what the Air Force really needs to do its job in terms of the United States against pick your adversary? But what does the Air Force look like if we start incorporating what we expect the rest of the team to do as part of a coalition? Has that influenced your thinking much at all about how much we have to do to bring along the rest of the team?
It's a great question, Andy. I'll give you an opportunity to add your 2 cents to this. This is the problem with a network force, a high-tech network force. It's not a network with allies and partners. So that's the challenge. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're getting at, but
Well, no, I mean, that is precisely what we get. So we talk about the pivot to Asia. There's the pivot to Asia, and that involves us against the Chinese. But then there's the pivot to Asia that involves our team against the Chinese. But what do we do to make sure the rest of the team is where they're supposed to be?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's plenty of examples out there where we are sort of bringing our team along and networking. Japan is a perfect example where our IADs and ballistic missile defense systems are absolutely linked. And it doesn't, candidly, take much to get involved in a network. I mean, sort of one sensor communicator with the right architecture can get you plugged into a network. And so maybe there's an opportunity using sort of this network advantage to, at relatively sort of low cost for allies and partners, to get plugged into our network by just making it clear that you get the benefits of a big network of understanding, decision-making ability by being plugged into this sort of coalition network. And so I think you're going to see Japan, once again, is the perfect example of how we're already doing that. But I think you're right to point it out, that we certainly can't leave partners behind as we construct this force. Anything?
The one thing I'd add is obviously the person by a foreign officer. So whilst I attempt to look at a pure model of the United States Air Force, it'd be a model that they could apply when we work alongside their allies. And the Air Force is in the moment working its strategic master plan and tidying the document up. And the critical component of that is adding a partnership plan, which looks at how the United States Air Force can better integrate its allies and partners into its core business. So that, I think, partially addresses the question you're talking about from a single service perspective.
And one sort of final thought, and that is, when we look at competitive advantages against peer adversaries, we're used to having technology be that competitive advantage for us, and it's unlikely to be the enduring advantage. But allies and partners are. I mean, that really is an enduring advantage for us, and so you make a good point about making sure that we're including technology. Sir?
Hi, I'm Philip Swords with the Air Force Times. Sorry for this byline. There's been a lot of support in Congress recently for potentially restarting the F-22 program. I think there is a role right now for a air superiority plane that operates only in the sort of air domain. Or should the resources be focused on something that maybe does more of the cross-domain approach to air superiority?
So would you like to comment on that, or restarting the line? Was that the question? Yeah, I think somebody said earlier, we ought to always be sort of looking at what's the best use of taxpayers' dollars in a challenging environment. So we sort of don't rule out anything at this point, but we're not prepared to sort of comment on the wisdom of that. But I would say that I was an early participant in QBRs where we planned to have upwards of 700 F-22s, and that was whittled down to 187 with about 120 of those, I think, combat code. It gets to a world where when you don't have a competitor in the air domain, you have numbers where you just can't accept attrition, and so I'm concerned that you have to have more numbers that you have now in a contested environment. So that's really the whole point of this discussion, which is we're pivoting back now from a monopoly to a contested air domain. So we've got to prioritize investment back to ensuring that we can always be done in the air.
Sir, how do you build a multi-domain airman?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll offer two observations, and Andy can sweep up the broken glass if I get this wrong. I would say two areas that I think are really important, and that is, I'll use a cyber example. When cyber was sort of new on the street, we rushed to produce cyber airmen, and we sort of rushed to the mission space. And since that time, we've created a very able cyber command that sort of does national cyber. And we're now realizing that the air domain is going to have airmen or somebody focused on air and cyber together to exploit, to control and exploit our domain. And that current model is unlikely to produce that kind of airman for us. So we've got to produce cyber airmen that aren't just doing national cyber, but are doing air cyber. And so what you're seeing now is a concerted effort on our part to sort of hold back and train airmen who are thinking about cyber for the purposes of the Air Force mission. The second one to me, and this is a personal viewpoint, is we have to do a better job integrating space and air. And that is, airmen that wear my kind of wings need to be better at talking about space. There's just a handful that do this really well, in my opinion. And that has got to be a more sort of open and collaborative work by both Space Command and those of us that don't wear space wings. And so that's a challenge. And so as we talk about a multi-domain force, we've sort of got to walk that talk, right? And so we can't oversat things that don't need to be sapped. We have to have open dialogue in venues where people that aren't space airmen that are talking wisely about the application of space power. And that's just a couple examples. Andy? Yeah.
Hi, Lee John Greco inside the Air Force. You had talked about you can't accept attrition or that you need larger numbers in places where it's an A218 environment. Do you see perhaps a funding shift from sort of the fighter programs to some of those third offset programs like LCAT that are dealing with attributable weapons, disposable weapons, essentially, really, like LCAT or Gremlins?
Yeah, if I understand your question, it is sort of how is third offset thinking of a shift in investment priorities for the Air Force in between sort of platforms and weapons? Is that maybe to characterize your question? I would say what we're now seeing in this budget is some sort of basic investments on the part of the department to sort of develop basic ideas that are part of the security strategy and sort of seed corn initiatives to students moving towards better able to compete against peer adversaries. I think this idea of sort of platforms versus weapons I don't think we made a fundamental decision about sort of standoff versus stand-in. I think you're right. We're always going to find there's some sort of mix of capabilities here. But I think that's a really fundamental question about, do you invest in highly sophisticated munitions that by just definition you'll have fewer of? Or do you invest in more capable platforms with lower cost munitions that you can keep in greater quantities? It's a great question. I don't have the answer for you today, but it's one we talk about a lot. Okay, to keep everybody on time, we'll take one more question.
So we talked about the basing and having a sanctuary in those basing, in that basing, and that's contested now. And then you hinted this ratio between short-range assets and long-range assets, and there's a lot of discussion in third offset writing about shifting that ratio. That maybe the ratio needs to move towards longer-range things. I don't need to be at that base anymore that you're contesting. I can operate from a lot farther away. Could you talk more about that and maybe link it to multi-domain?
Yeah. Sure, and I think this will be no surprise that we'll sort of come down on the balanced mix, right? That we see trade-offs in the ability where you can generate, sort of stand-in forces that can generate sorties very rapidly at short range and can be dynamically retasked. Whereas you have long-range fighters that are bombers that may be, deployed or re-employed for longer ranges that are sort of less dynamic. And so, but may have, sort of greater penetration ability. This is some capability we've learned over time that you need both of because you just can't predict exactly how the future fight might unfold. So at the end of the day, do you see in our thinking some dramatic sort of rebalancing from one to the other? I think it's just too early to tell, and I wouldn't say we're very far down on that road. I mean, as you know, we're sort of committed to having both capabilities in the Air Force, and we're on a path to make sure that we do that. Any other thoughts?
I think one really important point to raise, though, is the question of the point of contest. So the danger of the argument about standoff versus stand-in is it still assumes that you have two forces clashing over an adversary border. I think the nature of the problem we're trying to highlight in the Venn diagram shows that the cyber domain or space can be used to leverage an advantage into a physical domain. So that means I don't physically have to be where you are to have an effect against you. So the danger of the standoff standing questions, that's all we get to. We haven't appreciated the challenge that information technology presents, which the point of contest could be at Coates, or it could be in the middle of Europe, even though the adversaries are extended distances apart. So there's a fundamental component that I think that we need to pick up that your question doesn't quite get us to.
As usual, Andy took us to a higher plane, so thank you for adding that. Okay, hey, this has been a bit of a theoretical discussion today, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there. I think this is really, we just give you a bit of a window into the kind of work we're doing and the kinds of things we're thinking about. These will sort of trickle down into sort of more detailed strategy discussions and some of the questions we were all asking today. So very much appreciate you being here. Thanks for your advocacy of air power and your certainly interest that we in the United States Air Force are investing the taxpayers' dollars in the most effective way to secure our interests. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.